All right, boys and girls, we are back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm your host, Ben Domenech. You can email us as always at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. Happy to be joined once again by our New York correspondent at the Federalist, Dave Marcus, who you can follow on Twitter at BlueBoxDave. Dave, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Always.
So we have something important to talk about, something that's gone on in your backyard that you actually are going to try to do something about. And we don't necessarily endorse things like this at the Federalist, but, Axios has been leading us in a direction where clearly, we needed to be a little bit more participatory in our communities. And we do believe at the Federalist being participatory in our communities. In your case, there's something that's happening in your backyard in Manhattan that I know you're very concerned about. Tell me a little bit about it.
The Museum of Natural History, which I think even people who aren't from New York are probably familiar with from movies and just visiting and general knowledge. It was very much supported by former President Teddy Roosevelt, and for that support, they placed a statue of him at the entrance. It is a statue; it's an equestrian statue. He is on a horse. And next to him is a figure of an African man and a Native American. The sculptor was clear when this went up in 1940 that what he was really trying to represent was the fact that Teddy Roosevelt, who was a progressive, was trying to look forward to an America where everybody would be treated equal and where everybody would be brought in as a participant. Today, the progressives on the board at the museum and our progressive mayor, Bill de Blasio, and our governor, Andrew Cuomo, have all said that this statue should be removed. Just like the Confederate statues, just like the City Council of New York wants to remove the statue of Thomas Jefferson from New York City Hall. And it's a step too far. I mean, we at the Federalist and a lot of conservatives, not enough, frankly, have argued for years that this taking down of statues is really dangerous. And yeah, when I heard that one was coming down, I didn't feel like writing an article or going on TV was enough. And so I got together, with some of my conservative friends here in New York, and I said, hey, if I threw a very peaceful, nonviolent protest where we just go to the statue and make a little noise to try to defend it, would you be interested? And I got a pretty good response, so that's what we're going to do on Sunday.
So let's run through a couple of different things here. First off, forgive me for my lack of historical knowledge, but was Teddy Roosevelt a Confederate general?
Teddy Roosevelt was not a Confederate general.
Was he the guy who did the Trail of Tears?
No, he wasn't even the Roosevelt who interned Japanese Americans. That was a different.
And he was famous for being, a progressive, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Just making sure we're all on the same page.
Yeah, the guy right behind you there. That's the one.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah.
That's it.
He also had that whole thing with Ben Stiller in Night at the Museum. Yeah. So a couple of things about this that stick out to me. First off, obviously New York has been the source of a number of presidents, but that Teddy Roosevelt was someone who actually had an impact on the city in a significant way, and certainly there's others who had less impact in New York than he did, and as in his role as a reform-minded president of the Board of Commissioners of Police, he was someone who had enormous impact on policing and in a reform-minded way from a very young age. The other, certainly he's one of the people who has to be considered perhaps the best writer who ever occupied the presidency.
Grant might make an argument, but
yes, but
certainly one of them.
Certainly one of them. He had probably the most interesting career of any president. I mean, it's just a bizarre career in terms of the ups and downs. But in terms of this statue and what it's meant to acknowledge, it's the Smithsonian Roosevelt expedition, which was basically the basis for the American museum system in a impressive way. He brought back more than 11,000 animal remains and forms from his hunting trips, trips that were, despite that very large sounding figure, actually quite restrained given the things at the time. The issue involved there, I think, is that you have a situation where they really wanted to address the fact that he had brought all these things that are still in that museum today. In fact, in terms of the African exhibit, I believe there's an elephant there that he himself shot.
Yeah.
And there's a number of things that are in the Smithsonian. I know that there are others in other museums across the country. And so it's not like it's just a statue that's there because he's president. It's because he played a significant role. Tell me a little bit about what he means to you and why you think it's important enough to hold a protest yourself.
I mean, the fact of the matter is Teddy Roosevelt isn't really even in the top 5. I haven't thought about it enough, but probably not the top 10 of my favorite American presidents. As you say, he's an extremely compelling figure. And I think that his work in conservation, I mean, creating really creating the federal park system and saving, so many places from being developed and keeping natural ground out there was great. But this wasn't so much about Teddy Roosevelt as it was the fear that, you start with the statue outside the museum.
Yeah.
And as you point out, there's a lot of things that he brought back that are inside the museum. And there have been people, if anyone who's been to the museum knows that one of its big features is dioramas, where these animals are placed within a context, right? And that's come under scrutiny as well. And the progressive hegemony that exists within academia and the arts is very much alive in the museum system as well. So, I mean, that all really played into just my moment of saying, this is enough, right? I mean, William F. Buckley said, stand athwart history and say stop. I'm saying stand athwart the destruction of history and say stop. This had been in the water. There were progressive groups. There were small groups of people who were opposed to this statue for years, but no major outcry. I'd love to see polling. I really would.
There had been I'm sure that the polling would support keeping it up, because the fact is that as recently as just a little bit ago, there was indicating polling that still a majority of Americans still wanted the Confederate statues to stay up.
Yeah.
So I really doubt that they moved that quickly on Teddy Roosevelt. Part of the issue here, though, is that, again, you can dispute perhaps the artistic choices in terms of the framing of the Native American and the African who are next to him. But again, that's meant to indicate kind of what he did and as you said, as a progressive and the way he saw the future. And they even in a previous clash over the statue, they made an exhibit, right, that's supposed to like explain all of that and put it in context.
Yes, absolutely. And this moved, this like all of these culture controversies have moved so quickly. Libby Evans, who's one of our senior contributors and wrote an article in the Post Millennial where she had a fantastic catch of this 2012 New York Times article that deals with this exact issue. And to paraphrase that article, what they said was basically like, well, of course, this was intended to be a positive message about equality and America being a place where all races were able to exist together. But sort of acknowledged, well, it's a little cringy. It's a little problematic. And in 8 years, we went from it's a little cringy, it's a little problematic to we're taking it down.
Yeah.
And just when you add that to this whole thing, Molly Hemingway's article today about all of the people who told us, that we were fools for suggesting that as recently as what was it, 2017?
2017, yeah.
When Trump said, well, you're going to take down the Confederates. If you're taking down the Confederates, then why not Jefferson and Washington? They owned slaves. And everybody, the New York Times and NBC News, and they interviewed historians, and they all said, no, this is a straw man. This is ridiculous. Of course, it's not the same thing. And it's 3 years later, and we're doing it. I mean, come on, man.
Let me ask you one question that I'm curious about your perspective on, because you're someone who went from being pretty strongly anti-Trump to being someone who recognizes, a lot of value in him. Do you think this is a conversation you would be having if Hillary Clinton was president right now? And let me add something to that. There's a number of people I've heard that from in recent weeks, essentially saying none of this would be happening if a Democrat was in the White House. This is just something that they can do, and they're doing it because it's Trump in the White House. And if Mitt Romney was in the White House or something like that, they wouldn't be doing it. From my perspective, I think that's BS.
Yeah,
and I think that if anything, it would be happening. Sooner. It would be happening even faster, right?
Of course. Yes. No, I absolutely think it would be happening faster. And I think that if Mitt Romney was in the White House, he would probably, be saying, well, we have to be reasonable about this, and maybe this isn't the right time for this statue. And I say that because we're still seeing hemming and hawing, from conservatives about this. Yeah. You brought up the polling, right? Now, depending on where you look at the polling on, let's do, because all we have is the Confederate statues, right? So according to Morning Consult, only 33% of Americans in 2017 and still today supported taking down the Confederate statues. Quinnipiac has a poll that says 52 support taking them down. I think 44% support keeping them up. You would have no idea that that's the case from the way the media deals with this, because the entire progressive media, the entire mainstream media, who claim to be objective, they're 100% on board with this. Uh-huh. So you say, well, of course, the conservative media must be a stalwart against. Well, I mean, it's not. No. The conservative media is so terrified, I believe, of accusations of racism or losing further ground, that they think there's some compromise to be made here. And what they do is they keep drawing these lines in the sand that get blown over, and then say, okay, let's make another line in the sand. Well,
the tides just take them out. And
every time.
Yeah. One of the elements of this that I think is going to be particularly interesting is, I think kids grow up and they know about presidents who are on money. Mm-hmm. They know about kind of the most prominent ones. They might know Teddy Roosevelt as a president because of Mount Rushmore, but they're much more likely to know about it from the success of the Night at the Museum movies and Robin Williams' portrayal of him, which is as yes. this, grandfatherly type of figure, this, very, someone who's, very respected and paternalistic, and also like just, he's very likable. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's something that has to be, it's a major part of when you visit that museum, in the sense that this is meant to be an indication of your host for the exhibits and everything like that. We have a piece up by the time you watch this or listen to this today by Kylie Zempel that runs through all of the different animals that I mentioned and the exhibits that they're in and everything that Roosevelt did when it came to not just museums, but, as the president who we most associate with conservation and conserving the West and saving this ability. He was a hunter, obviously, but he was also someone who deeply believed in the importance of conserving nature and defending it. And that's something that I think we can all value. What are you supposed to do when you take a kid here who previously they all, climb all over that, the statue, not the one that they're talking about that's outside, but the one that's inside.
Yeah.
And take pictures with it and the like. And I've seen tons of kids, of friends of mine, do that. How are you supposed to have the conversation that basically says, oh no, we can't do that because, he was a dangerous colonialist, and explain that to them, as opposed to, talking about the fact that he's on that pedestal, not out of some colonialism or out of any kind of racism or anything like that, but because of those very virtues that made for the foundation of these educational institutions, these museums, the reforms that I mentioned, the progressive steps that he took.
Yeah.
and all of those other things for which we value him.
Well, look, Teddy Roosevelt was a progressive of his time, and there are certainly lots of things about Teddy Roosevelt for progressives of our time to object to. I mean, if you were to...
oh, yeah, no, if he was around today, he'd probably, I mean, if he was around today, he's basically Joe Manchin.
Yeah, no, well, or he's what's the guy from Barstool? I mean, he is toxic masculinity, right? You know what I mean? Like he is. If you did a dictionary definition of toxic masculinity, there'd be a picture of, you know, he is the Rudyard Kipling man, right?
Totally.
Who you're also not supposed to read anymore.
Yeah.
And that's fine. Like you know, that's okay. But yeah, I mean, you know, John Davidson has written so much about the lack of limiting principles and stuff. I mean, I think what you tell your kids about any of these figures is that people were deeply flawed. Guess what? People are still deeply flawed.
Yep.
And
people will remain deeply flawed.
they absolutely will. And the one question I always want to ask the cats who are like tearing all the statues down and stuff is like, you know, don't you assume that in 100 years you're going to look foolish? I mean, I hope so. Like, I hope humanity keeps moving forward in a way that's going to make us look bad compared to they are, compared to where they are. And I hope they have a little bit of sympathy for me as
you know,
someone who maybe...
If you were successful in defending this statue, it's very possible that 30 years from now, there's another group of people who come along who are trying to cancel Teddy Roosevelt because he ate meat.
Sure. Yes. You know, or yes. Yeah. I you know, it's, you know, I worry, you know, to bring it back to this point about Trump, you're right. I was and remain in some ways critical of Trump, and he makes me cringe a lot. And I you know, I get him. Like, he's from Queens. I live in Brooklyn. Like, I understand what he's doing most of the time. I still don't love it. But at a certain point, I realized this is transactional. And the other choice that I have, you know, like, I get it. Joe Biden's maybe himself not some crazy progressive radical, but Joe Biden's not in a position to restrain the AOCs of the Democratic Party, or you know, the congresswoman from DC today who said, let's take down the statue of Abraham Lincoln in Lincoln Park. Joe Biden's not in a position to say. Oh, Barack Obama might have been, right? Barack Obama might have been someone who could say to young Democrats, "This isn't what we're doing. This isn't who we are." Joe Biden's a placekeeper until they get somebody in there who's entirely on board with all of this reckless nonsense.
Yeah, and he's a vehicle for it in ways that I think would enable them to kind of turn to their worst devices. In terms of we are planned for Sunday, and you know, we'll include the link to what you're doing in the post for this. But what are you intending to do?
You know, that's still a little bit up in the air. Honestly, to begin with, you know, I talked to a couple of conservatives who I know here in New York, guys like Sohrab Ahmari and Buck Sexton and Ryan Gudersky, and just, you know, a couple of there are conservatives in New York City. And what I was originally envisioning, you know, and what it still may be, was something relatively small, like 25 or 50 people. I'd like to, you know, people who can, to maybe bring some flowers just to put at the statue as a sign of respect for Roosevelt and for this great piece of public art. Since I announced it, though, you know, Young Americans for Freedom has reached out to me and said, hey, you know, can we help? Can we send this to our members? You know, New York Young Republicans clubs, you know, other groups have you know, I think seen a need for this kind of action. So, speaking right now, I don't know exactly what Sunday's going to look like. I don't know if there's going to be speeches. I don't know if it's just going to be people coming to, you know, hang out and you know, I guess pay their respects to the statue. But that's still developing. I just wanted something to happen. I mean, I just, you know, the articles aren't enough anymore. So
No.
Something physical had to happen in that space. So we'll figure out what it's going to be.
Well, I'm curious to see what the response is like. And I think that, you know, one of the big elements here that we have, I think a little lack of appreciation for, is that there's really only one side of this argument that is doing anything. Mm-hmm. Everyone else is just writing things or tweeting things or posting things on social media. They're not actually doing anything. And so we don't really see what would happen if that was the case. The one exception to that, of course, is those Italians in South Philly.
Yeah.
And who were defending the statue of Christopher Columbus. And I think of that as kind of comparable to a little bit to what you're doing here, because I didn't get the impression from any of the conversation that they were having that any of them are all that invested in the choices and decisions of Christopher Columbus. It's much more about, well, a statue is a symbol. What does it symbolize? In this case, it symbolizes the full Americanness of Italian Americans being accepted after the turn of the century as members of society and as a point of our pride that we can look to and feel pride about where we came from, where our families came from, and what we have done as part of America. To me, whatever you say about American history, Teddy Roosevelt is one of the most significant Americans who's ever lived. And that's not going to change. And that's like still going to be true if they take that statue away. It's just that you have to at some point take a stand or decide where that stand is going to be.
Yeah, and don't forget, Ben, those South Philly guys, and I grew up with them. I mean, I grew up Irish in Northeast Philly, but, we're not that far apart. Those guys had just lost the Frank Rizzo statue.
Mm-hmm.
Frank Rizzo had been the mayor of Philly in the 70s, ran again in the 80s. And look, he had been police chief and he was tough and he did some things that were questionable. Unlike Wilson Goode, the first black mayor of Philadelphia, he didn't actually bomb the city, but he was a tough cop, right? Again, not a member of the Confederacy, as far as I know. But that statue went. And yeah, I think those guys in South Philly had a real feeling of like, you guys are going to try to burn it all down, and we're going to stand here, with baseball bats and say, you don't get to. I don't want any baseball bats on Sunday.
Yeah.
Maybe that's because I'm the Northeast Philly guy, not the South Philly guy. Well, the Northeast Philly guys like baseball bats too. I'm just a more gentle soul. But please, nobody bring any baseball bats.
But let me ask you this: the devil's advocate, would be the peace-minded conservative would say, well, yes, it is sad that Teddy Roosevelt statue is being removed, but I can understand how one might take offense to the depiction of the Native American and the African in the picture, in the statue, and we need to be respectful of our brethren, and also we should take solace in the fact that this is being done not by a mob, but by an organization in a pattern that presumably involved boardroom meetings and discussion and formality and process, as opposed to what we saw the other night of a roving squad of woke white women throwing ropes around Andrew Jackson's neck. Yeah. What do you say to those people who make that?
I think it's worse. I mean, I think this is drastically worse. And just as an aside, I once had I was once in Athens and I had a conversation with a guy who was a civil engineer who worked on the subway system that they had to expand for the Olympics. Mm-hmm. And he told me a funny story. He said, the problem was anytime you stick a shovel in the ground in Athens, Greece, you run into something enormously important. And it's you can't lay track here. And it's well, all right, let's move 5 feet and then there's more, right? So, I mean, these are people who clearly sort of respect their history, which I understand is much longer than ours, or much older than ours. But it would be nice if we as Americans had that kind of respect for, and in some cases we do, right? It depends what it is. It depends where it sort of hits on the intersectionality scale. But I would say in general, as to this notion of but it's the city government. City governments have proven themselves of late to be wildly out of step with even the people who sort of voted for them. I mean, you look at the Minneapolis City Council saying we're going to dismantle the police. That's not the opinion held by the majority of people in Minneapolis. When you look at the New York City Council members who are saying, let's get rid of the Jefferson statue in City Hall. Nobody's calling for that. So something's happened.
Can you explain that to our listeners, because they may not have paid as much attention to what has gone on in terms of the role that Bill de Blasio's wife is now playing in that decision?
Yeah, well, so the Speaker of the House and Speaker of the City Council and 5 other council members, progressive council members, asked Bill de Blasio to remove this statue of Jefferson from City Hall because he was a slave owner and all the reasons. As it turns out, his wife, Shirlane, was appointed, I believe, by him to run this council that is supposed to, or this committee that is supposed to look at all of the statues in New York City and determine, which one should stay, murals, whatever, what should stay, what should go, what's offensive, what's not offensive. And this is not, coming from some will of the people. And I think the broader question, whether you're talking about public education, whether you're talking about statues, whether you're talking about the police, something has happened in our big cities where there used to be Democratic Party machines that operated as gatekeepers so that the most extreme people were not getting into these positions of power. To a large extent, it was anti-corruption measures that said, well, these machines have too much power. Let's democratize this. And I think what's happened is that so little attention gets paid to local elections in our country that progressives, people like Justice Democrats, people who were supporting AOC and Ilhan Omar and all of these people, they really see local municipal big city elections as an opportunity to gain a disproportionate amount of power compared to the positions that are held by the people, and they've been wildly successful. Even in places like Dallas, where you've seen city councils move on stuff like Confederate statues, that, way ahead of public opinion. So something's going on in our cities in terms of that kind of representation that's really skewed right now.
There is a situation emerging in your neighborhood in terms of the election involving Elliot Engel. It looks like he is losing now to Jamal Bowman, someone who's been backed by AOC. Dave Wasserman, who's usually pretty good on these things with Cook Political Report, is suggesting that he thinks that it's going to be Bowman in the end of the day. Do you have any perspective on that in terms of what it means and what it indicates?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's telling in a sense because when AOC won and she defeated, oh my goodness, he was number 4 in the House, and his name is escaping me because he lost, I guess. But when AOC won and beat a long time incumbent, it came as a shock, like kind of out of the blue, and like, oh, maybe he wasn't prepared. This isn't the shock. Like, Engel knew this was coming. Engel had all the time in the world to prepare, as, like I mentioned, the Democratic Party machine did. Mm-hmm. And if he loses, then they still weren't able to protect him. Now, he fouled up in several ways. I mean, he came back to the city recently and said something like he wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for the Floyd protests, that he would have stated. He has not run a good campaign. But yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to this point of like, well, but Joe Biden's such a moderate. Well, who cares if Joe Biden's a moderate? If the entire Democratic Party is moving in the direction of the Justice Democrats, mm-hmm. then I don't take any solace in, Joe Biden having co-sponsored the crime bill in 1994. I don't think Joe Biden does either at this point.
Yeah, no, not so much. He'd like to forget that.
Yes.
Back to Roosevelt for a minute. One of the things that I think is going to be interesting, and this is something that I think is going to emerge as a conversation among DC-based Republicans, just because it does, virtually every time. There's always this defeatism among the RNC folks and anybody who's in a position of power. It basically goes something like this. They see their candidate starting to flail a little bit and they start to rationalize. Well, maybe things would be better off if we actually lost this cycle. If we lose this cycle, then we can come back strong in the midterms. Joe Biden is old. We could beat him with a young candidate in 2024. And, we don't have to worry about these kinds of things in terms of any immediate policy, because we got to concentrate on holding the Senate, and then good things will happen for us. Essentially, that's the argument that John Bolton has been giving. He gave it tonight on Fox News in his interview with Bret Baier. I always find that argument to be rather silly, because it doesn't really fully encompass every area of policy that can be affected in 4 years. But one of the elements of that is different this time about Trump is basically, we're just tired of this culture war stuff. And by that I mean the we in this case being leading Republicans and conservatives in Washington. And what I think that is mistaken about is two things. One is, I think they really do believe if Trump loses, that culture war stuff will take a break and stop. I think it won't. Mm-hmm. And second, I think that they view Trump as the cause or the precipitant factor in these culture war elements, as opposed to someone who has just at every turn fought back in different ways, often sloppy ways and sometimes ridiculous ways, but basically just he always punches back no matter what it is. What would you say to the people who basically make the argument, well, we just need to get rid of Trump because he's the fomenter of these crazy culture wars, and if we do that, then it's kind of a mirror image of the argument I gave you at the beginning, which is, well, if they do this, then maybe we'll be able to make Washington and the Jefferson Memorial and things like that survive under a Biden presidency, because Biden won't be for taking them down. And I doubt that he will be. But my view is that his election would absolutely embolden all the people under him within his party who want to do exactly that.
Yeah, I mean, look, of course. I think the greatest failure of the media in the Trump era, and this includes his campaign as well as his presidency, and, I don't know that I'd necessarily, exclude us from this criticism. I think the biggest problem is that everything is about Donald Trump in the news media. And that's not true. I mean, when you watched cable news, be it Fox, be it CNN, be it MSNBC, when George W. Bush or Barack Obama was president, there'd be a segment in an hour-long show on what the president was doing. And then there'd be 35 or 40 minutes about the rest of the news in the United States. There is no longer any rest of the news in the United States.
Yeah.
The only news in the United States is what Donald Trump is doing. And oh my goodness, did he use a racist term at his rally last night? Or, did he go to a bunker? Or whatever it is, it's 5 years of this now. And I think that does lead some people on the right to think like, well, if we get rid of him, then yeah, this culture war stuff, this culture war, I was in high school in 1992 when this culture war stuff was starting. This predates Donald Trump's political career by decades. I
Absolutely.
mean, this is not ultimately about Donald Trump, but I guess, as long as he's president, and maybe for some time after, even if he loses, everything is about Donald Trump. There is no other story, which I'm sure Donald Trump loves.
Oh yeah, I'm sure he does. Are you kidding? He absolutely loves that.
That's the goal, right?
There is no such thing as bad press. Yes. That's why he still talks to Maggie Haberman. Let's go out on this. In the past, I think that we could count on a certain number of stable folks within the media, academia, some within the political sphere, to basically be leavening influences when radicalism rose up. And that would include, a lot of people who were basically pro-cop, pro-union Democrats, but who had a lot of, presence of Catholics or, other people in their communities, gun owners or the like, where they would basically say, hey, slow your roll, radical progressives. You don't want to be in a situation where you're viewed as being at odds with the Bible and the flag. And that's something that a lot of different Democrats have said in a lot of different ways. But to me, that is a presence that is almost thoroughly absent in this moment. There's nobody who's out there saying, hey, we're Democrats. We don't want Andrew Jackson to come down. We still had Jefferson and Jackson dinners last year, and we shouldn't be cheering on the people who are doing that or describing them as peaceful protesters when people can obviously see that they are not. Everybody but David French can see that for some reason. The thing that is just really sad to me is that there was always a portion of the pro-military base of the Democratic Party that was willing to stand up to the extremes and say, no, that's not something that we want to do. The person I'd most like to hear from on this, by the way, at this moment is Jim Webb.
Sure. Ed Rendell.
Ed Rendell.
I like to hear what Ed Rendell thinks about defund the police. Where's Ed Rendell?
Yeah. I mean, it's like, where are these people? Where are these voices? Do you think that this is a situation where those voices are just older, out of step, completely cowed by these protesters? Do you think that they have any ability to make a comeback? Or do you think that this is going to be a situation where there's just no comeback for something like that?
I'll tell you, Ben. I'll tell you the exact moment when we knew that was over. It was, I can't remember if it was the first or the second debate, the Democratic debate, because both of them were 87 years ago in today's time. But when they got the question, and there were so many of them, I think there were 10 of them on stage, and they got the question, would you give universal health care to people who are in the country illegally? Raise your hand.
Yeah. Everybody
enthusiastically raised their hand, except for one guy, Joe Biden, in the middle. And what did Joe Biden do? Joe Biden went like this, as if to simultaneously say, I'm not quite raising my hand. I'm not quite against raising my hand. I'd like to make a more nuanced point about this. And the fact that there was not one Democrat on that stage who would say, no, this is crazy, guys. Like, of course we're not going to do that. I think answers your question.
Yeah. Well, I'll be interested to see what happens on Sunday. I'm curious how many folks will show up. We will link the Facebook page.
Brad Parscale says we have 800,000 responses so far.
Yes, you do. You definitely do. Those are definitely real numbers and real numbers. Thank you so much, Dave, for taking the time to talk to me about this, and good luck on Sunday.
Thanks, man.
I'm Ben Domenech. You've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.